Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Monica Sanduri from the MOURI Tech marketing team. Before we start the webinar, we trust each of you is hale and healthy during this global academic situation. We have a phenomenal month working on emerging technologies like virtual reality and augmented reality, especially on how virtual reality is set to transform the healthcare industry. In the due course of time, we at MOURITech, along with AiSolve, our partner company, have decided to have a breakdown session on how virtual reality is helping to save lives in the healthcare industry. Today's agenda revolves around who are we, followed by a brief introduction into the world of virtual reality, specifically what is resuscitation virtual reality. Also, we will discuss about a project implementation we have done in this industry. Further, during this webinar, we'll talk about how virtual reality is changing the lives in the healthcare industry. We'll have 4 different polls after every 15 minutes to understand the user adaptability to virtual reality. Request the audience to please participate. I would like to introduce today's speakers. Tom Dolby. Tom Dolby is the head of simulations at AiSolve. He spent the last decade working on computer-based simulations for training and education in various sectors and is currently focusing on virtual reality simulations for healthcare. Our second speaker, TJ Matthews. TJ Matthews is a research engineer at AiSolve. He has worked on AiSolve's Resuscitation virtual reality platform for many years and is currently researching the intersection of usability and immersion in improving virtual reality training praxis. A recorded version of this webinar will be available shortly or in the next couple of days. Due to time constraints, we have Q&A in the last 10 minutes. In between, if anyone have questions, please use the chat box. We would love to hear from you. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Now I hand over the webinar to the speakers.
Well, hi there. I'm Tom Dolby. Thank you for introducing us. To our one attendee at the moment. I hope we'll have a few more joining us shortly. We represent AiSolve, and we are essentially a company that is very much focused in we call XR technologies, extended reality. And so AiSolve's history sort of started around 2010 in training and education simulations. So for the last decade, we've had a lot of experience dealing with a lot of different sectors. And when these kind of extended reality technologies started becoming more commonplace in like 2016, that's when we kind of went from more traditional desktop applications and moved to more of a focus heavily emphasized on virtual reality and dealing with some of these other technologies as well with some of our subsidiaries. We cast our net quite wide. So we cover retail solutions, entertainment solutions, and of course training education is where we started and is still a major part of the business for us. And so myself as head of simulations, the training education department is the department that I head, and TJ is essentially my right-hand man, supporting all kind of academic background for what we do. So this webinar is mainly going to focus on kind of, I guess, our biggest case study, which is a project we did with Children's Hospital Los Angeles in 2016 when we were just getting started with VR. It kind of started our kind of road down healthcare simulations. We'd done a few things previously, but that partnership that we formed with CHLA in 2016 has really kind of became our main focus in the training education sector. So what started as a pilot study back in 2016, we went through some studies, and eventually we've kind of now launched it into its own product, which we call Resuscitation VR. And the journey of that project from pilot to kind of its first release in the market is one of the things that we'll be covering today. We want to try and make this as kind of applicable to anyone in healthcare. It's not really about kind of talking specifically about why our project is great. It's more about what people in the industry can take away from our experience in this. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk about what is VR. So I'm not sure sort of how familiar people are. I figure it's best, before we dive deep into talking about VR and using technical terms and things, I kind of just briefly give an overview of sort of what VR options are out there and what's the state of the market. So essentially, virtual reality is used for whenever you want to kind of immerse someone in a situation. It's when you want someone to feel like they are somewhere else, maybe in a different time, but certainly in a different place and in a different situation to where they are in the physical world. With a simple, desktop screen, there's a lot of things you can replicate, but in terms of getting people to kind of form an empathetic link with something and to actually feel like they're there and to engage with it, VR is a far more effective tool for that. And so, when you're using virtual reality, you need to make sure that you're using it for the right reasons. VR is a tool, and it's not a magic solution that will kind of make anything better. As with everything, it's if you know its strengths and weaknesses, that enables you to kind of get the most out of it. So in terms of the VR hardware which is currently out there, you may have heard of things like the Samsung Gear VR or the Google Cardboard. When VR was first starting up, you got a lot of these headsets which involved kind of taking your smartphone and inserting it into kind of more like a housing device. Kind of like it had a section to put your smartphone in, and that was a very easy way to get people to start trying VR, because everyone has a smartphone, and that just enabled them to start experimenting with the technology. But because you're kind of effectively producing a makeshift VR device, the quality isn't great, and these headsets are now effectively obsolete. They're no longer supported. You don't see any manufacturers at this stage producing more of them. So the quality just wasn't there, and now we're starting to see a shift to cheap standalone headsets. When VR first sort of becoming mainstream in 2016, you had products like the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive, which are still product lines that are going to this day, but they are all desktop based. They involve taking the VR headset, plugging it into a gaming specification PC, and they still to date offer kind of the best quality visuals, but they are definitely the most expensive option. But then, as I mentioned, you have the standalone headset solutions. Like you have the Oculus Go coming in around $150. It's like the new entry-level headset, effectively. And this is very good for 360 videos, simple experiences where scale is more important than necessarily the quality of the visuals. And then you have things like the Oculus Quest coming in, which again is a standalone headset, which is a bit more powerful and enables you to kind of like walk around what we call free roam. And each of these have like different technologies. Like some of the first kind of desktop headsets relied on sensors you had to mount on your walls to like track where you were moving around in virtual space. And but now we're moving to a technology that's called like inside-out tracking, which is more where you have cameras built into the headsets themselves. So there's no sensors you have to install anywhere. So each of these headsets kind of have like various levels of cost and fidelity. And one of the things you need to be doing after you've kind of designed what you want your VR experience to be, your next step is effectively to look at what headsets are out there in the market and pick what is most appropriate for you. There's no need to go with the most expensive straight away, or you don't want to pick something that's like underpowered for the kind of experience you want to offer people. And all of the headsets these days come equipped with motion controllers, which are all fairly similar these days. They kind of effectively replicate your hands. Typically you have one controller in each hand, and you have various kind of triggers, buttons, and joysticks that enable you to kind of like move your hands around and interact by pressing the buttons. We're starting to see a slight shift now into controllers that can kind of track individual fingers. And then right at the very high end is when you start getting into like bespoke hardware, which is like if your project really kind of needs those things. Like if you need to actually like feel the resistance of like when you're pressing against something, or if you're trying to replicate very kind of fine motor skills. So there's a large kind of range of what you can currently do with the technology that's there. It's about choosing what's appropriate. And essentially where we're seeing headsets going at the moment is trying to remove the dependency on wires, trying to remove the dependency on external systems like gaming PCs and anything else you have to attach to your headset. And the headsets themselves, although they're not currently getting smaller, they tend to be getting more powerful, so higher resolution, able to better quality visuals, and the controllers are steadily moving towards more kind of haptic feedback, whereas right now they're somewhat blunt instruments. So if I move on to kind of what is Resuscitation VR, so as I mentioned, our main case study for today. So essentially it is an application where you get to take the role of the code leader in a emergency resuscitation event. Right now it's just the code leader role. In future we're looking to expand it to other roles, but we're kind of like taking it one step at a time. So you as the code leader are thrust immediately into the emergency event. You're in the room with your staff and you have to make the decisions of what tools to use, what medications to give in order to save the child's life. It's what we call a complementary form of training. You'll hear me kind of like emphasizing this quite a lot throughout the webinar, in that it is not like seeking to replace what we say is like mannequin-based training is effectively the closest physical thing to what we are offering in virtual reality. But right now, VR is definitely not something that can replace that, and it's even very valid to argue that it should never replace that. Actual hands-on training with real people around you is always going to be the most effective form of training. But it is still, mannequin-based training still has gaps in terms of, how expensive it is and how often you can train. So yeah, VR is really about kind of filling in the gaps that the existing training can't do as a complementary tool. It's empowering new residents with the ability to self-study. They don't always need senior time. It now enables them to train more regularly. You can memorize better through the act of repetition. It allows new residents to build up their confidence. It's quite a big thing to perform in front of your peers for the first time, the pressure of that situation. If they can practice the protocol in their own time, by themselves, they can build up their confidence before they go in for the first time. VR offers a safe space to fail, effectively. We also can find it, it can offer a better representation of symptoms sometimes. Like one of the examples we've covered is was a pediatric seizure. And right now, mannequins, aren't able to replicate like a seizure anywhere near what you can show in a virtual reality experience. Sometimes in mannequin sims, people have to just say imagine the mannequin is seizing, or imagine it's throwing up now and things. Whereas you can have much more kind of immediate visual recognition of symptoms if you're in a fully virtual environment. And one of the sort of points of the initial pilot study we did this was actually about measuring the levels of stress that VR was able to replicate, which is something that TJ is going to cover later. But we found that VR is definitely able to kind of replicate what we call a productive level of stress. And we'll talk about that later. So to go into where the project started, again, I'll talk about how our project came to be, and then how you in the industry could think about how you can start your own projects, the things that we learned. So this was actually, it started out as a funded project. There's the headset manufacturer Oculus, which is now part of Facebook. They ran a campaign called VR for Good, because initially when VR was first a thing, everyone was like, oh, it's for games, it's for entertainment. The VR for Good campaign was about proving that virtual reality had real, use cases in training and education, and for non-entertainment kind of reasons, essentially. So we partnered up with CHLA and explored what we could do in the healthcare sector with VR. So as with all good projects, it started with a problem definition. We really need to kind of work out what problem we're trying to solve with the technology here. And so essentially, like I explained in the previous slide, we talked about through the problems with mannequin-based simulation. We explored what can VR, what is VR good for, and what is it not good for? So what gaps could be plugged with this technology? It was never from the beginning designed to be a replacement, but there were problems, and how could the technology help? And after we kind of identified what we thought VR could help with, then it came down to narrowing down, what was the scope of the project. So obviously, CHLA being a pediatric hospital, the main thing was about not having, staff not having the ability to practice these, what we call, high stakes, low frequency events. So we started going through what pediatric emergencies were kind of like suitable. We deliberately picked, we ended up picking pediatric seizure and pediatric anaphylaxis, specifically because the protocols to treat them worked quite nicely for what was available in VR. We knew that the controllers at the time, weren't very kind of good at hands-on things. So trying to do practical skills like being a respiratory therapist or injecting medications were things that weren't going to have very high value in VR. So the code leader role naturally kind of came to the forefront. And so these protocols for seizure and anaphylaxis, they kind of made sense for us as like nice, simple use cases to kind of base a pilot study on. And the next thing we had to kind of overcome the fact that we had, AiSolve, a group of nerds who could program and make 3D assets, and then we had a bunch of doctors who knew next to nothing about technology, but knew everything about how these protocols worked. We had two sets of experts, and we needed to work out how we could work together. So we kind of effectively had to form a common language. We kind of came up with diagrams, like flow diagrams, if-else conditions, like, if you give this medication, what happens? And so we kind of blocked out everything into diagrams and documents that kind of laid out everything in a language that everyone could understand. And we worked closely with the doctors with a high degree of transparency. The aim was to get a usable piece of software delivered to them as fast as possible, in a raw form with placeholder visuals everywhere, but enable them to just start seeing how it was working. And we kind of went through these rapid iteration cycles, where effectively we wanted to minimize the surprises. Because when you have a group of technology experts working with subject matter as complex as medicine, it's quite easy to just go off in a wrong direction, and there's a lot of assumptions working from both sides. So at some points it was like every week we were sending a new version of the software to them so they could keep trying it and correct our course if we went off any time. We also had to understand the users that we were working with. Throughout the training at the hospital, we were dealing with a wide variety of different ages. We had new residents coming in that were fairly, familiar with technology. But then we had some of the older doctors who were, had never even played a video game in their lives. And so, we can't forget that we're using computer technology. So we had to kind of go through steps to kind of see how they responded to the software that we were developing, and that helped us craft a tutorial. And the tutorial for Resuscitation VR actually ended up being effectively something that had no medical information whatsoever. It was just about getting people to practice in a stress-free environment how to just use the software, how to use the controllers they were given, and how the VR headset worked. We wanted to make sure they were completely comfortable in the virtual environment before they even touched, actual medical emergencies in the software. So the takeaways from this are essentially about, think about finding a source of funding, whether your departments have something, funding set aside for kind of more experimental things. We have a lot of luck looking for kind of research studies that can have some funding set aside for introducing technology. Essentially, it's just have your eyes open for different funding opportunities that can come available. We know it's quite difficult for companies to justify sort of spending on VR when it is still in its early stages. There is still more research to be done. It is not taken seriously everywhere just yet. But from all the research that we've been doing, we definitely see a lot of positive results coming in. But finding a source of funding definitely tends to be a way to get things off the ground quickly. Subject expertise working in tandem with technical teams seems essential for these types of projects. You need experts in both domains to be working together in order to produce something valuable. You need to make sure that you have the right people coming together for the right reasons, and you need to find a way for them to talk to each other. You need to start off with a problem definition. If your VR project starts off with, oh, that's just a cool technology, let's just see how it goes with putting it in this situation. If it's not solving real problems for you, it's never going to gain real traction. And so keep in mind what kind of audience, what end users are going to be using your software. There's still, most people in the world have never put on a VR headset before. So take careful consideration on how you're going to onboard people. Take particular care in crafting a tutorial that enables people to or enter the training on a level playing field, effectively. Okay. So before I move on to the next slide, we do have, like as was mentioned, some various polls that we're going to put out throughout the webinar. So I'm going to launch this poll now. So you should be able to see it popping up on your screens right now. So please vote. We're interested in how your organization is currently treating VR, how seriously you're taking it. Like, is VR something that's just maybe a mild curiosity? You don't really have any plans to use it right now. Maybe you're already using VR in your organization right now. Maybe you're kind of doing some experimentation, and perhaps within a year or two, you'll have some VR projects launching in your organization, or maybe you see it as like within 5 years. Long term, there may be something that comes to you. So I'll leave that running for now while I move on to the rest of the project background. So, as I mentioned, the initial project formed a pilot study. And so yeah, the title of the study there, it was all about kind of measuring how stress was used, well, how stress was replicated by VR. It was, is a question that we didn't really have any answers for at the time. Is like, can VR actually kind of immerse someone enough that they feel the stress of a real situation? How close can we make the fidelity? So, we deliberately went about and kind of picked out what were like stressful points. Like we introduced things like, the parent guardian of the child next to you kind of screaming and crying, and even like the atmospherics of having kind of like, the tannoy of the hospital blaring in the background, the beeping of the monitor, the look on the staff, on the faces of staff around you as they kind of like, sort of panicking and dealing with this situation. And we also kind of enabled the software to adapt to the user as well. We could sort of amp up the stress, that you could have kind of low levels of stress where like the staff around you are fairly helpful. And then we could even increase the level of stress where like, people are getting very impatient with you. And then like the difficulty of protocol as well, where like beginner levels, where if you just practice the protocol as it, by the book, everything goes fine. And then even to like advanced levels where, if you did things by the book, for some reason the protocol just didn't work. You had to think on your feet and use your critical thinking skills to troubleshoot and find a way to solve the problem. So after we it took us about 6 months to develop like these two initial scenarios, and then we went through like some internal testing just to make sure it was ready, and then it went through a kind of a trial. It was like from March 2017 to sort of the end of the year, where it got introduced into the hospital, and all the new residents were sort of going through this study, and we measured kind of like how they were responding to it. And TJ will cover the results of that study shortly. So after that study concluded, it had very positive outcomes. It actually got introduced as a mandatory part of new resident training at the hospital, and the doctors actually decided to form their own sort of consultancy company, SBC Medicine, in order to kind of develop more content for it. So we've been working with them to present day. We took the project, which was initially just on the Oculus Rift, and put it onto the Oculus Go headset. And we've now expanded the two scenarios that we started with. We expanded them out to a trial. And we opened this to any medical organization that was effectively interested in using VR. We kind of felt that even like last year, the market seemed a bit too early for any kind of like full-scale commercial solution to be launched. So we didn't want to try and rush things. We wanted to kind of put out what we had developed to kind of allow people to start just trying VR in their hospital, begin to familiarize themselves with the technology, and to begin to think about what their use case for it could be, where it could fit into their training. And so far to date, we've had over 70 medical organizations sign up to use Resuscitation VR. We're encouraging them to give us feedback that is kind of going to help us take it from effectively this kind of like initial trial to a full-scale commercial solution when we feel it's ready. So this journey that we've kind of taken, I need to re-emphasize that the VR is a tool, not a magic bullet. It's about how you choose to use it in your organization. It won't come in and fix problems automatically, and also to not expect VR to immediately deliver outstanding results on the very first attempt. We have deliberately sort of taken it slow because it will take some time to work out how best it can be embedded into a training environment. So even if you're working with technical geniuses, even if the technology, the product is great, the people in your organization still have to adapt to using it. As I mentioned, for many people, this will be using VR for the first time. No matter how good the training tool is, people need time to acclimatize to it and learn how to really get the best out of it. So effectively, it's like working with people. We're trying to kind of get the market to kind of work up an appetite for VR. And we're doing that on kind of like a very wide scale. But then, like, if you're talking about just your organization internally, there may be quite some resistance to having, a big, flashy VR project to be implemented straight away, to be making it mandatory straight away. There is likely to be like some resistance, and it may struggle to prove itself effectively without some time for people to adapt. So take time to kind of like work up curiosity within your organization and the appetite of people to have more of it. So we're going in future. So as the kind of our trial has now been kind of going on for over a year, we have now gone back and we've got further funding to kind of to further develop Resuscitation VR. So some of the things that we're looking to do so in future, so we're looking to expand it to multi-user role. At the moment, people practice by themselves, but there's an obvious benefit to allow people to work together, to train together, to fill out all the various roles in the room. And that also unlocks the opportunity to train remotely as well, which will be especially advantageous in disadvantaged regions. You can imagine kind of like if you're trying to train doctors in a disadvantaged country, the cost it takes to fly out medical experts and train them there, of how VR could be a complementary tool. Like doctors in the US could be, training doctors in Indonesia or something, the other side of the world, sharing that medical knowledge. we want to promote things like that. We spent a lot of time developing kind of a back-end analytics system so that everything that users do is automatically captured, and it can kind of give a quantitative and qualitative analysis at the end. There's a big potential for VR to kind of really empower self-study. We're developing artificial intelligence that can kind of like take a lot of the strain away on debriefing, and to kind of enable a more personalized learning pathway for each user. You know, if someone is struggling with hands-on skills, like if someone is struggling with making decisions in, you know, an effective time frame, you know, if someone's hesitating too much, using artificial intelligence, all of this can be analyzed automatically, and, you know, a user can kind of see their performance over time. You know, senior clinicians can see how all of their new residents are doing in a comparison, and, you know, everyone can kind of get an individually tailored kind of learning experience for that self-study. We're always looking to support kind of more hardware. You know, we currently support the Oculus Go and Oculus Rift. We're now looking to do the Oculus Quest as well. With all of the different countries that we're currently, you know, so over 20 countries are now involved in the trial, we're beginning to understand the localization requirements. You know, it's not just language. I'm sure all of you are familiar in the healthcare sector of how different countries have, you know, different forms of medical practice. We need to understand all of those requirements. The pilot study initially started out with just using motion controllers to kind of like select which tools you wanted to use, which medications to give. So now we want to use voice control instead. It's like a far more natural form of interaction. And, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have kind of seen like a Alexa, Siri, Google Assistant, and so forth. It's using that same technology of, you know, giving orders verbally and having artificial intelligence sort of attempt to kind of do, you know, natural language processing. We're going to start seeing much more of this in the future. You know, we're hoping that we will be kind of leading the way in some of that for people to interact far more naturally. You know, so don't just see VR as its own technology. Keep your mind sort of wide and see what other technologies you can bring in to complement it. You know, a lot of technology has lots of different ways that it can work together. You don't need to treat each technology in, you know, in isolation. You can merge different technologies together to solve multiple problems at once. And of course, the biggest thing for us is once, you know, we've kind of established this strong foundation for the product, that's when we start to kind of scale it more vertically. We'll have more modules. You know, once we kind of feel that we've got a strong understanding, then we start rapidly expanding the content that we have, when we can feel more sort of confident that the approach that we're taking, you know, is ready to scale. And a big part of what we're doing as well is trying to support independent empirical study into everything that we're doing, so that you know, independent validation of our work, you know, having more academic papers and evidence out there will strengthen VR as a technology going forward. So the more evidence that's out there, kind of like the better case it will have. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague TJ, and he can talk a bit more about you know, the research, the original pilot study that was done on the product.
Hi everyone, so I'm TJ Matthews. Just reintroduce myself. I'm the research engineer at AiSolve, so I handle sort of the academic studies and outcomes. Before I go ahead, it might be time to do another quick poll. Tom, I think you'll have to send that off quick.
Yep, we'll just launch the third one now. Okay, so for this poll, we're looking at, you know, which of the following kind of things is more kind of interesting to your organization. about what would encourage you to have a VR project, or what's kind of important for you in order to take it seriously.
Which I think ties in nicely to what I'm going to go over in a bit more detail here now. I appreciate we started a bit late, so I'm going to try and get through this relatively quickly, but won't be offended if everyone needs to drop out. So yeah, we're going to talk about the research methodologies that we did primarily for the Resuscitation VR studies. When we worked with CHLA in the first place, this was, as was previously mentioned, a project that was kind of founded off the idea of evaluating where best to use VR in medical training. The study that Dr. Todd Chang and sort of the rest of the team at Children's Hospital Los Angeles did is the one that was previously mentioned, looking at optimal stress levels. So essentially the way this worked is they compared the stress levels of expert residents and junior residents in both real life resuscitation events and in virtual resuscitation events as through our Resuscitation VR platform. And what they essentially found was, whilst expert residents obviously had lower stress levels overall, junior residents typically had higher stress levels in both, but the stress levels inside the virtual reality simulations were a much better in-between level. They obviously weren't as high as the real life resuscitation events, but they were still higher than average, and they were higher than other forms of training. So what this means is it kind of puts it in that ideal stress level area. So you can see the graph on the right-hand side here. It's basically showing that VR is a good sort of warming up stage, particularly for junior residents who you don't want to put straight onto the ward to deal with real life resuscitation events, particularly because they're high stress. They aren't necessarily typically trained in a lot of the soft skills that cover those areas. So with that outcomes, it's now mandatory for their junior resident training program. And they're currently going on at the moment, and we're helping out with this in testing essentially how best to implement it into that curriculum. So whether or not they do traditional mannequin training first, whether or not they do this virtual reality simulation training first. As we mentioned earlier, this is something that should be kind of considered as supplementary and supporting. This isn't going to replace all other trainings, but it's going to help reduce some of that cost. It's going to help reduce some of the time that's needed to be allocated to it. And I think most importantly, as we hear from hospitals, it's going to reduce the number of staff that need to be allocated to it at once. I can imagine at the moment, especially staff numbers to go into training are going to be lower than average. What we're doing on our end, Tom mentioned about the voice control earlier. We're looking into how to increase basically the level of immersion. With that level of immersion, it's kind of proven to come with higher learning outcomes. Okay, yeah, so you can see from the poll results that it's pretty much split down the middle for all of them, really. So yeah, kind of all of these things are stuff that we're either studying at the moment or there's a good research backing behind it. I'll cover our overall, and then if anyone wants any further information or like links to studies or links to the research papers, then feel free to shoot us an email or leave a message in the chat during the Q&A section. So yeah, as I was saying, the immersion section, so we're looking at hand tracking and we're looking at intelligent voice control. And the outcomes of those are made to be that it means that trainees can replicate more closely their behaviors that they would do in real life resuscitation events. If you imagine you're in a virtual simulation, the way you control is not exactly the same as the way you control in real life. And so we're trying to bridge that gap as much as possible. And then what we've ended with on this slide, you can see that kind of other established success in VR. There's a lot of research papers supporting VR in various different medical training fields, surgery, nursing, so on and so forth. But there are other areas that have crossover within healthcare that it may be worth everyone in this room sort of thinking about. Like visualization is one that comes up a lot. Remote collaboration, even if it's just discussing patient files, looking at like X-ray data, that sort of thing. There's other stuff outside of the usual training scope. And then we'll go into some of the areas where VR can help. So Tom, if you want to, cheers. So this is kind of an overview of basically the main benefits of VR. The main benefits over particularly traditional training, whether that's mannequin or textbook. So one of the core ones is it helps build confidence, especially in new trainers. One of the core reasons for this is that it's that freedom to fail, especially freedom to fail in especially medical training, where failure comes at a high cost. And especially we find in other fields, particularly like surgical training as well, you can't fail in when we think about very expensive physical simulators. Messing with those is going to have a high resource cost. Similarly, we talk about here in consistent engagement of all learner types. Because virtual reality is particularly immersive, it means it kind of covers all the bases of those different learner types, whether it's audio, visual, or tactile. Everyone is kind of catered for by default. Limited staff, equipment, and materials. We covered a bit of this earlier. It's VR by default is cheaper overall, less time overall. Again, we have lots of research data backing this. The research data out there, so if anyone wants any of that, feel free to ask afterwards. When on-site training is dangerous or restricted, if you imagine any training which would typically either involve patients or patient replicas, this is the best way to get it to be fully realistic and immersive. It's the only possible way really to do it fully realistic and immersive. Similar to some of the previously mentioned, this means that for seniors, tutors, or learners, where their time is more scarce, which I imagine at the moment is going to be more than average, VR is something that can quite easily dip in and out of. So we've compared this against traditional mannequin training, particularly in Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Their mannequin training session typically lasts about 5 to 10 minutes, and it takes half an hour to set up sort of either side. This Oculus, especially the Oculus Go version we sent out to them, that you put it on, you press a button and it starts. It takes less than a minute to set up. So you imagine you can dip in and out and kind of do this repeatedly without the necessity to have all those other resources backing it. Similarly, because debriefing for traditional mannequin training can take a while, and because it kind of needs to take place immediately afterwards, whereas in VR, everything is kind of automatically tracked so that debriefing can take place at any stage because everything is recorded, whether it's from the point of view of the performers or whether it's the point of view of other actors in the room or other angles, and we can see all the behaviors and the actions that have taken place and sort of track patterns automatically. So some baseline feedback can be given without the necessity to go into that sort of, without the necessity of the supervisor being there immediately, essentially, which also helps when the trainees and the trainers are remote. So they can both share the same room in a virtual space, regardless of where they're located geographically. We're seeing a lot of successes at the moment. As you imagine, almost everyone is working from home. And so having virtual reality meeting spaces to share information and to go over procedures together is kind of core and crucial at the moment. It really is benefiting a lot of industries, including healthcare. And kind of the last one is basically impossible interactions. I know there are a lot of very expensive physical simulators for a lot of medical training applications, but some of them just aren't at all feasible to replicate using physical sort of machinery-based training devices. Where in VR, essentially, your imagination is the only limit. Anything can be programmed, anything can be produced. So I'm going to go on to what types of training is VR best for. So this is kind of looking at it more from the angle of what kind of procedures should you sort of initially thinking of. This isn't the be-all, end-all. This is just ones we particularly have found great success in. This is in both our Resuscitation VR and frankly across all of our different training platforms. So following procedures that require critical thinking. This one is quite clear when it comes to medical training, especially for resuscitation training, where it's all about high-risk decision-making in a very stressful environments. Training environments that are hard to replicate traditionally. Again, for emergency resuscitation rooms, it's quite clear, and this is going to be true of most medical environments. For emotional engagement and immersion, one thing we did in the Resuscitation VR platform is there are different stress level difficulties. And what this essentially means is we can start the residents off at a lower stress level It means there's less evocative language. It means the immersion levels are a bit lower because they don't have additional noise factors surrounding them. The noise factors are relatively realistic to what they would be in real life. We're talking about alerts going off. We're talking about other distractions from noises outside the room. So we can build them up. We can kind of scaffold their learning so they get to the more realistic outcomes, which have a higher stress, but also so it builds their soft skills at the same time. Well, I mentioned scaffolding here. The way Resuscitation VR and the way all of our medical training and all of our training in general is formatted, it's based on the concept of repeated escalating experiences. So you start them off on we could call it easier, but a more simplistic procedure base. Resuscitation VR, for example, in one of our modules, well, actually, in both our modules, but in anaphylaxis, for example, in the earlier training sections, you give the appropriate medication and the anaphylaxis reaction stops and comes to an end, and the patient is saved. However, in the more difficulty ones, we've added what can be, in some rarer cases, and added complexity where the initial medication doesn't work. So we're training the doctors to know about the added complexities that could be in that scenario, and not just getting them out there to make assumptions based on what we've given them. So there are different variations in place which are accurate and realistic to what actually could happen out on the resuscitation ward. And similarly to situated training, in the Resuscitation VR room, it was initially based entirely off the actual realistic Children's Hospital Los Angeles room. And the one that comes in the resuscitation package at the moment, it's pretty realistic to most traditional US healthcare resuscitation rooms. And when we're doing localization, that's one of the things that comes up as well, is as it goes to sort of different countries where there are tweaks that need to be made for medication names, for equipment locations, for sort of procedure areas. That's going to change, and that means that every hospital gets the specific learning outcomes that would be most applicable to that hospital. So I'm going to move on to kind of talking about where VR is evolving for the future, but where it isn't so necessarily most supported at the moment, let's say. So it's kind of the current frictions. These are stuff we should be expecting to see in the next sort of few years, kind of up to 5 years, but aren't the kind of things which are commonplace or standard now, but will probably most likely become standard in the future. So the first one of this is haptic feedback. A lot of medical training at the moment can use very expensive machines to replicate moving surgical tools, for example. However, in the VR space, you can use those, which are very costly, but there's not much outside of that area which is necessarily well supported in medical training. The reasons for this are kind of twofold. The first one is it's quite new, and so it's quite untested, and that's why I'm talking about it's going to come up more in the future as it becomes more tested. And also it's very costly, so a lot of organizations aren't wanting to sort of put their leg out and be the first to try this necessarily while there's still these sort of lack of learning outcomes. Secondly, there's a lack of sort of physiological training involving environmental factors. This includes stuff like fire, water, and wind. Where this applies in medical training, it really depends on the kind of the extremities of the scenario you want to go for. But this is the sort of thing which is becoming popular in some other areas, but it still is costly. Particularly it's bespoke for individual projects, and again, it's kind of untested. So this is stuff which you may see in the future, but for the time being, if you want to go into it, you kind of have to look to where to where the successes are. And then finally, some stuff we're actually working on at the moment as well is immersive conversational agents. So this is particularly when it comes to like speaking to patients, or particularly for like closed loop communication, which is where we come in to some of the research we're currently doing. It's not necessarily that it's not untested, or sorry, not necessarily that it's not tested, but it's not available off the shelf yet. One of the things we're developing is planning to help them, planning to go into our research training in the future, but it's still very heavily in development. So what this means is that in the future, it's going to be more possible to go into virtual reality and have fairly realistic conversations with patients, with doctors, and kind of interact in that manner. And so just going to go into the best practices here. So we're talking earlier about how we did Resuscitation VR. We talked about sort of what hardware's out there. We talked about how they've implemented at CHLA into their curriculum. And so we're just going to kind of disseminate that down and sort of into the core themes, essentially. So kind of starting with appropriate hardware. When we're looking at the new generation of VR hardware, it's the stuff we mentioned earlier. You want to look at where the reduced costs and increased options are. For mobile versus desktop, where will the hardware be used and what degrees of freedom will be needed? So what this means is, are the doctors going to, and the trainees going to want to be walking around? Are they going to be sat at their desks? You know, what kind of space is available to go into these training scenarios? And similarly, to talk about external tools and interfaces. So are there external additional hardwares that would benefit from being implemented into the virtual reality space? Talking about the embed into curriculum. When it comes about the onboarding debriefing, that's what Tom mentioned earlier about how the VR simulations are framed and how we share and discuss training progress outside of VR. Our Resuscitation VR platform has a web interface for sharing sort of recorded performance data. That's great for debriefing, but how that debriefing happens is kind of on an organizational front. We will support through as one of the things that kind of needs to be thought about as where you would best like to place that. Similarly, for talk about scalable scenarios, we've spoken about repeatable and extendable and configurable VR scenarios, which kind of allows the learning content to scale with the skills of the trainee. It ensures that kind of optimal task load, those kind of optimal stress levels mentioned earlier. And that's kind of the same with scaffolded learning as well. For gathering information, what's best to do at this point is, if you're interested in a specific learning outcome, is to look at into the journals and conferences which have already existing VR research into that. My job role here is to help with that. So if anyone has any specific sort of questions they would like to ask in that area, then feel free to shoot them across. And that also comes into the task technology fit, which is some of the work we do as well, which is finding what affordances of VR should be prioritized. What kind of VR possibilities are most applicable to the kind of project that you're looking to do. That's kind of the same with the intervention needs, is what problem is this actually solving? And when we know what the problem is, we know where the best solutions in VR can be found. Some of the stuff that needs to be considered when it comes to what VR to use is looking at the session size. We kind of have a mixed bag of clients who want to do individual training sessions and who want to do group training sessions. Kind of both can be supported simultaneously depending on the project scope, but that's something that kind of needs to be thought about earlier on, because that's going to affect what can be done. Same with the user hierarchy. With Resuscitation VR, we have admins who have other learning supervisors of groups, and if that's the sort of thing that you need, then that kind of ties in nicely to sort of the existing system we have. But if there's additional affordances that need to go into that, that's something that should be discussed early on. And the same with the accessibility and resources. Kind of, there's lots of different platforms out there to publish apps on and to share apps around. So it's not down to you as a client at all to disseminate out and to share out these apps and these applications when it comes to the actual deployment stage. And lastly, just get involved. Reach out and discuss, speak to VR companies like us, and ask lots of questions, ask lots of recommendations. We have plenty. We've been in this industry long enough to sort of know where the strengths and weaknesses are, and we're going to be upfront and honest and sort of show you with your idea where best to move forward from this. Same with attending industry events. It's great everyone's come out to see this webinar, and there's lots of other places out there which are very similar. There's big events. Most of them are going virtual at the moment, but they're available there to be visited. And finally, try demos. So we have the Resuscitation VR demo, which if anyone wants to sign up and try that out, then basically send an email out to one of us, and we can arrange that. And sort of as more stuff happens moving forwards, you'll hear updates from us, basically. And so kind of finally, I wanted to just kind of go over a bit about what's next for VR and healthcare training. As Tom mentioned earlier, it's kind of early stages. And what that means necessarily isn't that it's untested, it means that it's in the stage of becoming standardized. It hasn't quite become standardized yet, but there's enough popularity and there's enough adoption by basically a lot of major healthcare industries, institutions, and sort of partners to say that VR isn't going anywhere, but the state of, or the sort of the full extension of how and where it's going to be placed, it's still finding sort of what the best opportunities for that are. So I kind of wanted to cover a bit on the UK and US side of things, and the same is going to be true of lots of other different countries, I would imagine. Kind of looking at the NHS in the UK, sort of heavily invested into getting VR into their institutions. And these are from, and then the last two quotes are from some of our US partners talking about how VR is just essentially becoming standard for their training outcomes, whether it's in Resuscitation VR for some of the resuscitation outcomes, but the same is also true of surgery and nursing and patient care and lots of other different fields, too many to name for this session essentially. But you can see that, yeah, VR is becoming standard in the healthcare industry. So now is the best time to get on board basically and sort of reach out and sort of get projects off the ground. And so I'm going to pass back to Tom to just say our thank yous, and we'll do a quick Q&A session.
Yes, so thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, so if anyone wants to stick around and ask some questions, we are available. I think we also had one more last question on the poll. So while people are thinking of questions, I can launch that for people. So like, from some of the things that we've been talking about over the course of the webinar, we're interested to know which kind of potential benefits are most exciting to you. So it'd be interesting to see people's thoughts on that.
And when you've done that, at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A section, which I believe means you should be able to just type in Q&A questions and we will be able to answer them for you. Or just put them in the chat and we'll answer as many as we can.
So thank you to everyone who's attended the session.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, as previously mentioned, if anyone has any follow-up questions from this, just email. Probably Tom's email is on the screen at the moment. You can tweet at us at AiSolve, or go to our website, which is aisolve.com, and we are more than happy to field even the most preliminary of just sort of interests in sort of where VR can be most beneficial at the moment.
All right, so I had a few answers in the poll here. So again, a pretty even split across a lot of the answers, but yeah, training remotely is definitely something that excites people, and yeah, automated assessment as well. So yeah, both things that we're very keen to kind of have more research in, things we're actively developing at the moment.
Yeah, I think that fits nicely. It's yeah, as Tom mentioned, these are all things which are kind of in the development of our Resuscitation VR platform, because this is a discussion which is kind of shared across a lot of different conversations that have taken place in the healthcare sectors.
Yeah, it's quite nice to actually see like a fairly even split across all of them, to be honest. So it's nice to know that all of the potential benefits are quite sort of valued.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, well, everyone here, as we mentioned, if anyone wants to throw any questions and answers into the fields, we'll stick around for as long as anyone wants to chat. And if not, then thank you so much for your time, and hope to hopefully hear from you soon, and best of luck with whatever VR you plan to do in the future.
Thank you.